The bear kept returning to the burned forest. What it was searching for moved everyone to tears. The forest no longer sang. Where once birds filled the air with dawn songs and squirrels darted through branches, now there was only silence. Blackened trunks rose like broken spears from the earth, their bark scorched and crumbling. The wildfire had come like a storm, raging for days, consuming everything in its path until nothing was left but smoke, ash, and ruin. Ranger Daniel walked carefully across the brittle ground, his boots crunching on charcoal that used to be leaves. He had worked these mountains for more than 20 years, but he had never seen them so lifeless. Every tree he passed felt like a gravestone. And then he saw it. Not far ahead, moving slowly through the haze of lingering smoke, was a massive grizzly bear. Its fur was streaked with soot, and its shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. It wasn't foraging, nor was it hunting. Instead, it paced back and forth across the same clearing, nose pressed low to the ground as though searching for something lost. Daniel froze. A bear in the open was nothing new, but its behavior was unusual. Most animals had fled to the deeper valleys after the fire. Yet this one stayed. Day after day, locals reported seeing it in the same place, wandering, digging, sometimes sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed on the earth as though waiting for it to speak. Some villagers whispered that the bear was cursed, bound to the ruins of the fire. Others feared it was growing dangerous, warning Daniel to stay away. But as he watched from the edge of the clearing, Daniel felt no fear. What he saw in the bear's slow, deliberate movements was not rage, but grief. The thought sent a shiver through him. Could it be mourning? The burned forest was silent, yes. But beneath that silence, Daniel realized, was a story, one written not in words, but in the heavy steps of a grieving bear. Daniel leaned against the charred trunk of a fallen pine, his eyes never leaving the great bear. Something about the animal stirred an old memory, faint but persistent. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a weather-worn notebook where he kept field sketches and notes from his patrols. Flipping back through the pages, he found what he was looking for, a rough pencil sketch of a mother bear with 2 cubs. He had drawn it months earlier, before the fire, when the forest still thrived. Daniel remembered that day clearly. He had been checking trails near the river when he spotted them, 2 small cubs tumbling over each other in play, while their mother watched from a sunlit clearing. The way she had looked at them, protective, proud, had struck him, and he had felt compelled to capture the moment. Now, staring at the bear pacing the burned ground, Daniel wondered if this was the same one. Her coat bore the same lighter patch across the shoulder, though now it was dulled with ash. And her eyes, deep, amber, restless, were unmistakable. His chest tightened as the truth began to take shape. The cubs were gone. The fire had not spared them. The realization weighed heavily on him. For weeks, this bear had been returning, searching, digging, sniffing the air for scents that no longer lingered. It wasn't a curse or a haunting. It was a mother's grief. Daniel closed his notebook slowly, his fingers trembling. He had lost people in his life, a brother in an accident, his parents years before, but he had never seen grief expressed so plainly in an animal. This bear was not simply surviving the fire's aftermath. She was trapped in it, circling the ashes of her own memories. And Daniel, standing in the ruins of his beloved forest, felt something he had not expected, a kinship with the sorrow in her eyes. The next morning, Daniel returned to the clearing. The bear was already there, her massive form outlined against the gray horizon. Ash swirled in the air like snowflakes as she dug furiously at the base of a scorched log. Daniel crouched low, watching from a distance. Her claws tore through the brittle earth, scattering charred roots and fragments of wood. Every few moments, she would stop, sniff the soil, and then dig again with renewed desperation. There was nothing there but ash, yet she searched as though the ground might suddenly give back what it had taken. He felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen animals mourn before, elephants standing guard over bones, wolves howling for lost packmates, but never like this. The bear's grief was raw, relentless. She wasn't just mourning. She was refusing to accept that the cubs were gone. When dusk fell, Daniel followed her at a distance as she moved through the ruined forest. She nosed at hollowed stumps, overturned burned branches, and sniffed at the air as if chasing a scent only she could sense. Each time she came up empty, her shoulders slumped lower, but she pressed on. Then, as the moon rose, the sound came. A long, low cry that shook the stillness of the night. It wasn't a roar, nor a growl. It was something closer to a wail, stretched and broken, carrying across the valley like a song of sorrow. Daniel felt the sound pierce through him. He closed his eyes, letting the grief settle in his bones. He had come expecting to witness survival, perhaps even danger. Instead, he had stumbled into a vigil, one that played out night after night under the empty sky. The forest had burned. The cubs were gone. But the mother could not stop searching. And Daniel, though only an observer, felt himself drawn into her relentless, heartbreaking quest. Daniel couldn't shake the sound of the bear's cry. It followed him home, echoing in the corners of his cabin long after the night had fallen silent. By morning, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. If the bear was to survive, she needed more than memories. She needed help. He carried a sack of food, fish from the river, berries from a nearby grove, and trekked back to the clearing. At first, he left the offering on a rock at the forest's edge and retreated to watch. Hours passed before the bear finally approached. She sniffed the air, growled softly, then ate, but without the joy or hunger of a wild animal. It was mechanical, as though her body demanded food, but her spirit resisted. Daniel repeated this for days, each time moving a little closer, each time waiting silently as she grew accustomed to his presence. Slowly, she stopped growling. She would glance at him, amber eyes tired but no longer hostile. In that silent exchange, he felt trust beginning to form. When he told the villagers what he was doing, most shook their heads. "It's dangerous," they warned. "You'll get yourself killed." But an elderly woman, eyes misty with age, laid a hand on his arm. "Grief doesn't fade," she said quietly. "Sometimes it returns to the very place it was born. Maybe you were meant to be there with her." Her words stayed with him. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Daniel saw the bear pacing wildly, her restlessness sharper than ever. She clawed at the earth near the clearing, then stopped, staring at him as lightning cracked the sky. He realized she wasn't warning him away. She was urging him closer, toward the truth she could not uncover alone. For the first time, Daniel stepped into the clearing not as a ranger, but as a companion. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the forest damp and heavy with the scent of rain. Daniel returned to the clearing, his lantern swinging at his side. The bear was there, waiting, her fur glistening with droplets. She moved with urgency, circling the same patch of scorched ground where she had clawed the night before. Daniel set down his lantern and knelt beside the disturbed soil. His hands trembled as he brushed away the loose ash. Beneath the blackened earth, something pale emerged. At first, he thought it was a shard of wood. But then the shape became clearer, small, delicate bones. His breath caught in his throat. The bear let out a low rumble, not of anger but of sorrow. She lowered her head, her massive body sinking to the ground beside him. Daniel swallowed hard, carefully unearthing more. Tiny ribs, a fragile skull no larger than his palm, the remains of a cub. Tears stung his eyes. He had known deep down, but seeing the truth laid bare in the soil was unbearable. This was what she had been searching for, what she had been mourning. The wildfire had stolen her family, and all that remained now were these fragile pieces of a life cut short. Daniel whispered softly, words meant as much for himself as for her. "I'm so sorry." The bear pressed her nose to the bones, inhaling deeply, then let out a sound that was neither growl nor cry, something ancient, a voice of grief older than language. Daniel felt it vibrate through the earth beneath him. With quiet reverence, he gathered the remains and carried them to a nearby rise. Using stones, he built a small cairn, a marker against the endless ruin. The bear stood silently beside him, watching, as though she understood. When he placed the final stone, the bear lifted her head to the sky and released a cry that echoed through the valley, a farewell, a vow, and a memory carved into the silence of the burned forest. In the days that followed, the forest slowly began to heal. Tiny shoots of green pushed up through the ash, fragile yet defiant. But the clearing, marked by the cairn of stones, remained a place of silence. A place of memory. The bear did not leave. She returned each day, padding softly across the blackened ground, her eyes fixed on the marker Daniel had built. Sometimes she sat beside it for hours, motionless except for the rise and fall of her breath. Other times she circled the clearing, as though ensuring no harm would come to the resting place of her cubs. Daniel visited too. He brought food, water, and sometimes simply his presence. He never intruded when the bear was near the cairn, but he watched from a respectful distance, his heart heavy yet strangely comforted. The bond between them was no longer one of survival, but of shared mourning. Word of the vigil spread. Villagers who once feared the bear began to walk into the burned forest, bringing wildflowers, pine branches, and offerings of respect. They laid them gently by the cairn, whispering prayers for the cubs, for the forest, and for the mother who would not forget. And through it all, the bear stayed. She was no longer frantic, no longer digging in desperation. Her grief had not vanished, grief never does, but it had softened into something quieter. A watchful love. A memory honored. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing. The bear lifted her head, amber eyes meeting his, and for a long moment, no words were needed. He understood. Love, even in its rawest form, does not vanish with loss. It lingers, it guards, it remembers. And as long as the bear returned to the cairn, the burned forest would no longer be a place of death. It would be a place of devotion. And in the ashes of the burned forest, what remained was not just loss, but a mother's love, eternal and unbroken. This story reminds us that love does not end with tragedy. Just like the grieving bear, our bonds endure even when life takes away those we cherish. Grief is not weakness, it is proof of the love that once was, and that still lives on.